The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of a small village in northern India. The year was 1987, and in a modest home made of clay bricks and corrugated iron sheets, a boy named opened his eyes to the sound of his mother preparing breakfast. He was 7 years old, thin as a bamboo stick, with large, curious eyes that seemed to drink in everything around him. His father worked as a daily wage laborer at the construction sites in the nearby town, leaving before sunrise and returning after sunset, his body covered in cement dust and sweat. His family belonged to what society called the lower caste. This meant that doors remained closed to them, opportunities passed them by, and dreams were considered luxuries they could not afford. His mother washed clothes for wealthy families in the town, walking 3 kilometers each morning with bundles balanced on her head. She earned barely enough to keep rice in their stomachs and a roof over their heads. Yet she always told that education would be his ticket to a different life, a better life, a life where he would not have to bow his head before anyone. The village had one school, a government institution with crumbling walls and teachers who rarely showed up, attended classes sitting on the bare floor, sharing torn textbooks with 5 other children, writing on a small slate because notebooks were expensive. But he was a bright student, absorbing knowledge like desert sand absorbs rain. His teachers noticed his sharp mind, though they did little to nurture it. In their eyes, a boy from his background had a predetermined destiny that no amount of intelligence could change. Everything changed on a hot summer afternoon when he accompanied his mother to one of the houses where she worked. The family was wealthy, owners of a textile factory that employed half the town. Their house was a mansion compared to anything had ever seen. It had marble floors that felt cool under his bare feet, ceiling fans that whispered softly overhead, and rooms filled with furniture that looked too beautiful to touch. His mother had warned him to stay quiet, stay invisible, and not touch anything. She needed this job desperately. While his mother worked in the back of the house, washing mountains of clothes by hand, sat in a corner of the courtyard, making himself as small as possible. But then he heard it. A sound floated through the air, unlike anything he had experienced before. It was music, but not the film songs that played on crackling radios in the village. This was something different, something that seemed to speak directly to his soul. The notes rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle as a mother's lullaby, sometimes powerful as a thunderstorm. Followed the sound as if pulled by an invisible string. He walked through corridors he was not supposed to enter, past rooms he was not supposed to see, until he reached a large hall with high ceilings. And there it was, a piano. He had never seen one before except in a torn magazine page he had found near the garbage dump. The instrument was massive, black and shining like a mirror, with white and black keys arranged in a pattern that seemed magical. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, sat before it, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced ease. She was the daughter of the house, dressed in clothes that cost more than his father earned in a year. Stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The music wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold night. He did not understand what was happening to him, but something deep inside his chest began to ache. It was a hunger, a desperate longing for something he could not name. He watched the girl's hands move, and somehow, somewhere in his mind, he knew that his own hands wanted to do the same thing. His fingers began to move unconsciously, mirroring the movements he saw, pressing imaginary keys in the air. The music stopped suddenly. The girl had noticed him. Her face twisted with disgust, and she jumped up from the piano bench as if she had seen a cockroach crawl across the keys. She screamed for her mother, pointing at with an accusing finger. Within seconds, the peace of that beautiful room shattered. Servants came running. The lady of the house appeared, her face red with anger. And then's mother was dragged into the room, her wet hands still covered in soap, her eyes wide with fear. The lady shouted words that cut like knives. How dare this dirty boy enter her home? How dare he stand in her music room? Did his mother not teach him that people like them had no business being in such places? Mother fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness, tears streaming down her face. She promised it would never happen again. She swore her son would never set foot in the house. She pleaded to keep her job because without it, her family would starve. Wanted to speak, wanted to explain that he meant no harm, that he only wanted to hear the beautiful music. But the words stuck in his throat like thorns. He watched his mother humiliate herself, her dignity crumbling piece by piece, all because of him. The guilt was overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on his small shoulders like a mountain. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the lady relented. She would keep his mother employed, but the boy was never to come near the house again. Never. On the walk home that evening's mother did not speak. Her silence was worse than any scolding. When they finally reached their small home, she sat him down and looked into his eyes with an expression that mixed love with profound sadness. She told him that she was not angry at him. She understood that he was just a child curious about the world, but she needed him to understand something important. The world was not fair. Some people were born with golden spoons in their mouths, while others were born with empty hands. Their family belonged to the second category, and the sooner accepted this reality, the easier his life would be. But could not accept it. That night, lying on the thin mattress he shared with his two younger siblings, he could not sleep. The music played over and over in his head like a recording that would not stop. He closed his eyes and saw the piano, magnificent and mysterious. He saw the girl's fingers moving across the keys. And he felt that hunger again, that desperate need to touch those keys himself, to make that incredible sound flow from his own hands. He made a silent promise to himself that night. Someday, somehow, he would play that instrument. He did not know how. He did not know when. But he knew with absolute certainty that his life would not be complete until he did. The days that followed were difficult. Went to school, helped his mother with chores, and tried to be a good son. But his mind was elsewhere. He began to notice music everywhere. In the rhythm of his mother grinding spices, in the pattern of raindrops on the roof, in the cadence of the birds singing at dawn. He started tapping his fingers constantly, on tables, on walls, on his own knees. He would tap out rhythms and imagine they were melodies. His family thought he was developing a nervous habit. His father sometimes snapped at him to stop the incessant tapping, but could not stop. The music inside him demanded to be expressed. One day, while wandering near the town center, discovered something that changed his life. A small music shop stood in a narrow alley, its windows dusty and its paint peeling. The owner was an old man named, a former music teacher who had retired to this quiet life of selling instruments and sheet music to the few people in town who could afford them. In the window of his shop stood an old upright piano, nothing like the grand instrument had seen at the rich house, but a piano nonetheless. Stood outside that window for hours, just staring at the keys, imagining what it would feel like to touch them. Noticed the boy standing outside his shop day after day. At first he thought was perhaps casing the place for a robbery. The old man had seen enough of the world to be suspicious. But as days turned into weeks, he began to see something different in the boy's eyes. It was not greed or mischief. It was longing, pure and painful. Had seen that look before, many years ago in the mirror when he himself was a young boy dreaming of becoming a musician. He decided to speak to the child. Was terrified when the old man approached him. He expected to be chased away, perhaps even beaten, but's voice was gentle. He asked why he stood outside the shop every day. At first, could not answer. No adult had ever asked him a question with genuine curiosity before. Finally, the words tumbled out in a rush. He told about the piano in the big house, about the music that had captured his heart, about the dream that burned inside him like a flame that would not go out. He spoke until his voice grew hoarse, and his eyes filled with tears. Listened without interruption. When finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. Then he did something that would remember for the rest of his life. He invited the boy inside the shop. Hesitated, remembering what had happened the last time he had entered a place where he did not belong, but something in his eyes told him it was safe. He stepped through the door into a world of instruments and music stands and stacks of yellowing sheet music. The smell of old wood and polish filled his nostrils. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. Led to the old piano in the window, he pulled out the bench and gestured for the boy to sit. Hands trembled as he lowered himself onto the seat. The keys stretched before him, black and white, intimidating and inviting at the same time, told him to press a key, any key. Lifted his right hand slowly, his finger hovering over a white key in the middle of the keyboard. His heart pounded. His mouth went dry, and then he pressed down. The sound that emerged was a single note, clear and pure. It was not a melody, not a song, just one simple sound. But two, it was everything. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and he did not bother to wipe them away. He pressed another key, then another, listening to each note as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. Watched the boy with growing amazement. He had taught many students over the years, students from good families who had the best instruments and expensive teachers. But he had never seen anyone respond to a piano the way this poor boy did. There was something here, something rare and beautiful, something that could not be taught or bought. But reality soon interrupted. The door of the shop banged open, and a man stormed in. It was the father of the girl from the big house, the factory owner. He had seen enter the shop and had followed him inside. His face was twisted with rage as he demanded to know what this dirty beggar boy was doing touching the piano. Did not know who this child was. Did he not know that people like had no right to touch such instruments? The factory owner threatened to ruin his business if he allowed the boy to remain in his shop. Was an old man who had spent his life avoiding conflict. He had survived by keeping his head down and not making enemies. The factory owner was powerful, connected to politicians and police. Going against him would be foolish and dangerous. Saw the old man's face change, saw the conflict in his eyes, and knew what was coming. He slid off the piano bench before could ask him to leave. He walked toward the door with as much dignity as his small body could muster. At the doorway, he turned back for one last look at the piano, burning its image into his memory. Then he walked out into the harsh sunlight of the real world. That night cried himself to sleep. His mother held him in her arms, rocking him gently, not understanding what had happened but feeling her son's pain as if it were her own. She whispered that everything would be all right, that he was a good boy, that better days would come, but was not sure he believed her anymore. The world seemed determined to crush his dream before it could even begin. He was too young to understand words like caste discrimination or social injustice. He only knew that something inside him was dying, and no one seemed to care. But the human spirit is resilient, especially in the young. As days passed, his grief slowly transformed into determination. If the world would not give him a piano, he would find another way. He began to study the instrument from afar, observing anyone who played keyboards or pianos in the town. He memorized the layout of the keys, understanding that the pattern repeated again and again across the keyboard. He learned that there were white keys and black keys, and that pressing them in different combinations made different sounds. He drew a piano keyboard on a piece of cardboard and practiced fingering on it every night, imagining the sounds his silent movements would make. Months passed, and his cardboard piano became worn and soft from constant use. His fingers developed calluses from pressing against the hard surface. He taught himself to read by finding an old music theory book in the garbage heap behind the music shop. The book was water-damaged and missing pages, but treated it like treasure. He struggled with the complex notation at first, but his sharp mind eventually began to decode the patterns. He understood that the black dots on the lines represented notes, that their position indicated pitch, that their shape indicated duration. Music, he realized, was a language, and he was determined to become fluent. The villagers' thought was strange. Why did this boy spend his time staring at cardboard when he should be learning a useful trade? His father grew increasingly frustrated. There was no money in music, he argued. The family needed to start working to contribute to their income. The boy should learn masonry or become a mechanic. These were practical skills that would put food on the table. But his mother, who had watched her son's passion grow despite every obstacle, made a decision. She would work harder, take on more washing, so that could continue his education. She would give him a few more years to pursue his dream before reality forced him to abandon it. A year after his first encounter with the piano, something unexpected happened. Old came looking for. The music shop owner had not forgotten the boy with the burning eyes. He had thought about often, troubled by his own cowardice in not standing up for the child. Had lived a safe life, but now, in his twilight years, he began to wonder if safety was worth the cost of a dream. He found home, knocked on the door, and made an offer that would change everything. He would teach piano in secret, late at night when the shop was closed and no one would see. He could not promise much, just an hour here and there whenever it was safe. But it was something. Could not believe what he was hearing. He looked at his mother, who looked at with suspicion. Why would this old man offer to help her son? What did he want in return? Understood her hesitation. He explained that he had spent his whole life teaching music to children who took it for granted. He had watched wealthy students come and go, never truly appreciating the gift they had been given. But in his eyes, he had seen something different. He had seen genuine passion, the kind that could not be manufactured or bought. Teaching would not be charity, said. It would be an honor. It would give meaning to his remaining years. And so began a journey that no one could have predicted. 3 nights a week, after the town had gone to sleep, would slip out of his home and walk through dark streets to shop. The old man would be waiting, the piano lid open, a single lamp casting warm light across the keys. Those stolen hours became the most precious time of his life. Started from the very beginning, teaching proper hand position, finger exercises, basic scales. Absorbed everything like a sponge, his natural ability shining through despite his complete lack of formal training. Quickly realized that he was dealing with something extraordinary. His ear for music was exceptional. He could hear a melody once and reproduce it with remarkable accuracy. His fingers, though untrained, moved with surprising grace and coordination. More importantly, he had that intangible quality that separated mere technicians from true musicians. He played with emotion, with soul. The notes that came from his fingers were not just sounds but feelings, stories, dreams made audible. Had to remind himself that this child had never touched a piano until a year ago, had never had a lesson until now, had learned everything from observation and imagination. The secret lessons continued for months, and skills grew at an astonishing rate. He mastered scales and arpeggios with unusual speed. He learned to read sheet music fluently, his earlier self-study providing a strong foundation. He began playing simple pieces, then more complex ones, introduced him to the great composers, telling stories of and while listened with wide eyes. These men had faced their own struggles, explained. They had fought against poverty, illness, and the expectations of society. Yet they had created music that would live forever. If they could do it, why not? But secrets are difficult to keep in small towns. Whispers began to circulate. Someone had seen the lights on in shop late at night. Someone else had heard piano music coming from the building in the early hours. The factory owner's son, a cruel young man who enjoyed tormenting those weaker than himself, began to take an interest. He followed one night and discovered the truth. The next day he told his father everything. The factory owner was furious. Not only had him, but the dirty beggar boy had dared to continue pursuing music despite being told to know his place. Something had to be done. The attack came without warning. A group of men arrived at shop one evening while was having his lesson. They broke down the door and stormed inside with wooden sticks and iron rods. Tried to protect his student, standing between the men and the boy, but an old man was no match for young thugs. They beat until he fell to the ground, bleeding and gasping for breath. Then they turned their attention to the piano. While watched in horror, they destroyed the instrument with savage fury, smashing the keys, breaking the strings, splintering the wood until nothing remained but a pile of debris. The men did not touch. They did not need to. The message was clear enough. The factory owner wanted the boy to understand that there were consequences for those who did not accept their place in society. They left lying in the wreckage, groaning in pain, and walked out into the night, laughing and congratulating each other on a job well done. Knelt beside his teacher, tears streaming down his face, begging the old man to be all right. His eyes were swelling shut and blood trickled from his lips, but he managed to squeeze his hand. He whispered that the boy must not give up. The piano was just an instrument. The music was inside, and that could never be destroyed. No matter what happened, he must promise to keep the music alive. Neighbors eventually came, attracted by the noise. Was taken to the hospital where doctors said he would survive but would need months to recover. His family was terrified. His father dragged him home and locked him in their small room. He shouted that it brought danger upon them all with his foolish dreams. What would happen when the factory owner decided to target them next? They could lose everything, their home, their livelihood, their very lives. Music was not worth dying for. From this day forward, his father declared, there would be no more talk of pianos, would accept his fate like the generations before him. He would learn a trade, work hard, and never again reach for something that was not meant for people like them. Did not argue. He did not have the strength. He lay on his thin mattress that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling emptier than he had ever felt before. The cardboard piano he had made lay hidden under a pile of clothes, but he did not reach for it. What was the point? Every time he took a step toward his dream, the world pushed him back harder. Maybe his father was right. Maybe some dreams were meant to remain dreams, beautiful but untouchable, like stars in the night sky. He closed his eyes and tried to forget the sound of the piano, tried to silence the music that still echoed in his mind. But even in his despair, the melody refused to die. It played on, soft but persistent, waiting for the day when it would be heard again. 3 years passed like slow-moving clouds over the village. Had grown taller, his boyish face sharpening into the features of a young teenager. He worked alongside his father now, mixing cement and carrying bricks at construction sites, his hands rough and calloused from labor. He had kept his promise to his father, never speaking of pianos, never showing interest in music. But promises made under pressure are difficult to keep, and the flame that burned inside had not been extinguished. It had merely retreated deeper, hidden from the world, waiting for its moment to return. Old had recovered from his injuries, but he was not the same man. The attack had broken something in his spirit. He sold what remained of his shop and moved away from the town, some said to live with relatives in another state. Before he left, he had tried to visit, but the boy's father had turned him away at the door. Heard about this from his mother, and his heart ached with guilt and longing. He had never gotten to thank his teacher properly, never gotten to say goodbye. Had given him everything, and had been unable to do anything in return. This failure haunted him during sleepless nights. Life in the village continued with its unchanging rhythm. The factory owner's family remained powerful, untouchable by ordinary people. The girl who had screamed when she saw in the music room had grown into a young woman, and there was talk of her going to study in America. She would have opportunities that could never imagine, doors that would open for her simply because of the family she was born into. He sometimes saw her being driven through town in an expensive car, her face turned away from the dusty streets and the people who walked them. She had probably forgotten that a dirty boy had once stood in her music room, moved by the sound she made without thinking. His mother had grown older too, her hair streaked with gray, her back beginning to curve from years of bending over washing tubs. She still worked at the same wealthy houses, though she was slower now, and the younger women who came for the same jobs made her nervous about her future. She had never stopped believing in her son, even when he buried his dreams and became the laborer his father wanted. She saw the sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She heard him humming melodies in his sleep, his fingers moving against the mattress as if pressing invisible keys. She knew the music still lived in him, trapped and struggling to break free. Everything changed again on a monsoon evening when the rains came down so hard that the construction site closed early. Walked home through flooded streets, his clothes soaked through to the skin. As he passed the town's community center, a rundown building that hosted government programs and occasional cultural events, He heard something that made him freeze in his tracks: piano music. It drifted through the rain like a ghost, faint but unmistakable. For a moment, thought he was imagining it. Perhaps his mind was playing tricks, conjuring sounds from memories buried deep. But as he moved closer, the music grew louder and more real. The community center was hosting a cultural program, some kind of event organized by the district administration. Slipped inside, his wet footprints marking the floor, and found a seat at the back of the hall. The room was half empty, mostly filled with bored government officials and their families. But on the small stage at the front, a man sat at an electronic keyboard, playing classical Indian ragas adapted for Western notes. He was not particularly skilled, just a local teacher earning extra money by performing at government functions. But to who had not heard live piano music in 3 years, it was extraordinary. The performance ended with polite applause and the audience began to disperse, but remained seated, unable to move, his eyes fixed on the keyboard. The musician noticed him and asked if he wanted something. Found his voice with difficulty. He asked if he could touch the instrument just for a moment. The musician laughed and said the boy was welcome to try, clearly expecting nothing would come of it. He stepped aside and gestured toward the keyboard with an amused smile. Approached the instrument with trembling legs. It had been so long. He sat down on the stool and placed his hands on the keys, feeling their smooth plastic surface. The keyboard was nothing like the beautiful piano in shop, but it would do. He took a deep breath and began to play. At first, his fingers felt stiff and uncertain, struggling to remember movements they had practiced years ago. But muscle memory is powerful, and soon the old patterns began to return. His fingers found their rhythm, and music poured out of him like water from a broken dam. The musician who had been performing stopped laughing. The few people still in the hall turned to look. Played a piece that had taught him, a sonata that he had practiced countless times on the old piano in the dusty shop. His technique was rusty, and there were mistakes, notes that clashed where they should have harmonized. But there was something in his playing that transcended technical perfection. There was emotion, raw and pure, the accumulated pain and longing of 3 silent years finding release through his fingertips. The music spoke of dreams deferred, of hopes crushed and renewed, of a spirit that refused to surrender. When finished, there was silence. Then slowly someone began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the small audience was applauding with genuine enthusiasm. The musician stared at with wide eyes, asking where he had learned to play like that. Did not know how to answer. He had learned from an old man who sold instruments, practiced on cardboard and imaginary keys, and played real pianos for only a handful of stolen hours. His education was incomplete and unconventional. But the results were undeniable. Among the audience that evening was a woman named, a music teacher from the city who had come to the small town to visit relatives. She had studied at a conservatory in Mumbai and had performed at concert halls across the country. She knew talent when she heard it, and what she heard from this thin, wet boy in worn clothes was remarkable. She approached after the hall emptied and introduced herself. She asked him about his background, his training, his story. Was hesitant at first, reluctant to share the painful memories. But something in his eyes, a warmth and sincerity that reminded him of, made him open up. He told her everything. The big house with the grand piano, the girl who screamed, his mother's humiliation, the cardboard keyboard, secret lessons, the attack that destroyed everything. He spoke for nearly an hour while listened without interruption, her expression shifting from curiosity to anger to admiration. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she made him an offer that seemed too good to be true. She taught at a music school in the city, a school that sometimes offered scholarships to talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds. If could pass the audition, he might be able to study there for free. It would mean leaving his family, traveling to an unfamiliar place, starting over in a world he did not understand. But it would also mean finally pursuing his dream in earnest. Did not know how to respond. 3 years ago, he had given up hope. He had accepted his father's judgment that music was not for people like him. He had buried his passion so deep that he thought it was dead. But here was this stranger, this educated woman from the city, telling him that his dream was still possible. Was it real? Or was it just another cruel trick the universe was playing on him? He thanked politely and said he would think about it. She gave him a card with her contact information and said she would be in town for a week if he wanted to talk more. That night lay awake with his mind racing. His father would never approve. The family needed his income, however meager. Leaving for the city would be selfish and irresponsible. But a voice inside him, small but persistent, asked a different question. What was the point of living if he had to kill the best part of himself? What was existence without hope, without dreams, without the music that made his soul come alive? He had tried to be practical, to accept reality, to follow the path laid out for people of his background. But it had brought him nothing but emptiness. The next morning did something he had not done in years. He retrieved his old cardboard piano from its hiding place. It was falling apart now, the keys barely visible, the surface soft from years of handling. He placed it on his lap and began to move his fingers across it, playing silent melodies that only he could hear. His mother came into the room and stopped when she saw what he was doing. Their eyes met, and in that moment 1,000 words passed between them without a sound. She sat down beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. She said that she had been waiting for him to find his music again. Told his mother about the scholarship, about the possibility that had suddenly appeared from nowhere. His mother listened carefully, nodding slowly. Then she asked him a simple question. Did he want this? Not what his father wanted, not what society expected, not what was practical or safe. Did he, in the deepest part of his heart, want to pursue music? The answer came without hesitation. Yes, he wanted it more than anything. He had always wanted it, even when he pretended otherwise. The music was part of him, and denying it was like denying his own existence. His mother smiled, a rare expression that lit up her tired face. She said that she had saved some money over the years, a small amount hidden away for emergencies. She would give it to him for his journey to the city, and she would handle his father. This would not be easy. There would be arguments and anger and tears, but some battles were worth fighting. She had watched her son suffer in silence for too long. She had seen the light dim in his eyes and had felt powerless to help. If there was even a small chance that this woman was genuine, they had to take it. Dreams did not come knocking twice. Convincing's father was exactly as difficult as expected. The man erupted in fury when he heard the plan. Had everyone in this family lost their minds? Did they not remember what happened last time? The factory owner's men had nearly killed Old. Did they want to bring that kind of trouble upon themselves again? And who was this city woman anyway? She was probably a fraud, looking to exploit naive village people. Even if she was genuine, what kind of life would have in the city? He would be a nobody, a low-caste boy trying to compete against children from wealthy families. He would fail and return home humiliated, having wasted years that could have been spent learning a useful trade. Listened to his father's arguments with a patience he did not know he possessed. When the older man finished, spoke quietly but firmly. He acknowledged that his father was trying to protect him, trying to save him from disappointment and pain. But a life lived in fear was not really a life at all. 3 years ago, had given up his dream to keep the family safe. He had tried to be the son his father wanted, but he had been miserable every single day since. The music inside him was not a hobby or a childish fantasy. It was who he was. If he could not pursue it, he did not want to live at all. These were not words of rebellion but of simple truth. Would rather fail trying than succeed at giving up. His father stared at him for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the man his boy was becoming. Something shifted in the older man's expression, a mixture of pride and sadness that he struggled to hide. He did not give his blessing, could not bring himself to encourage a path he considered foolish and dangerous, but he did not forbid from going either. He simply said that the boy was old enough to make his own mistakes. If he wanted to chase a dream that would probably break his heart, that was his choice. But he should not expect any help from his father when things went wrong. A week later, boarded a bus to the city with a small bag containing everything he owned. His mother stood by the roadside, waving until the bus disappeared around a corner. His siblings had clung to him that morning, confused about why their brother was leaving. His father had not come to say goodbye, sitting inside the house with his back to the door, but as the bus pulled away, saw something through the window that would stay with him forever. His father standing at the corner of the house, partially hidden, watching the bus with tears streaming down his weathered face. The journey to the city took 12 hours on bumpy roads through changing landscapes, watched through the window as his village gave way to other villages, then to small towns, then to larger towns with more vehicles and more people. The world grew busier and louder the further he traveled. By the time the bus entered the city, he felt like he had landed on another planet. Buildings rose so high they seemed to scrape the sky. Vehicles of every kind flooded the streets in a chaos that somehow moved forward. People walked with purpose and speed, their faces focused on destinations he could not imagine. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Met him at the bus station, her familiar face a welcome anchor in the overwhelming newness. She took him to her apartment, a modest but comfortable space in a middle-class neighborhood. She had arranged for him to stay in her living room until the audition, explaining that if he was accepted, the school would provide dormitory accommodation. She asked him about his journey, about his family, about how he was feeling. Answered honestly that he was scared. Everything was so different here, so fast and loud and unfamiliar. He was not sure he belonged in this world. Reassured him that every talented person she had ever known had felt the same way when they started. The fear was normal, even healthy. It meant he understood the magnitude of what he was attempting, but he should not let fear stop him. He had already overcome obstacles that would have broken most people. This was just another challenge, perhaps the biggest one yet, but not insurmountable. She would help him prepare for the audition. They had 2 weeks to get him ready. It would be intense, but she believed in him. The preparation that followed was the hardest work had ever done. Was a demanding teacher, pushing him to correct bad habits he had developed from his unconventional training. His fingering was often wrong. His posture needed adjustment. His understanding of music theory had significant gaps. She worked with him for hours every day, drilling scales and exercises, teaching him pieces appropriate for the audition, expanding his knowledge of musical history and technique. There were moments when felt completely overwhelmed, convinced that he was not good enough, that his natural talent was no match for years of proper training. But saw what others might have missed. Beneath the rough edges, there was a musician of rare potential, had something that could not be taught, an instinctive understanding of music that transcended technical skill. When he played, even with his imperfect technique, there was a magic that made listeners stop and pay attention. The notes seemed to come alive under his fingers, carrying emotions that words could not express. This was the gift that was determined to nurture. The technical skills could be developed with practice, but the soul of a true artist, that was something already possessed. The music school where taught was an impressive institution, housed in an old colonial building with high ceilings and long corridors. Students from all over the country came to study there, most of them from wealthy families who could afford the expensive tuition. They had private teachers, their own instruments, parents who supported their musical ambitions with unlimited resources. Walked through the building for the first time with a sinking feeling in his stomach. How could he compete against people who had had every advantage from birth? His old insecurities came rushing back, the voice that told him he did not belong, that people like him had no business in such places. The audition day arrived with bright sunshine that seemed at odds with turbulent emotions. He wore the best clothes could find for him, a simple but clean shirt and trousers that almost fit. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly washed. But beneath the surface, his heart pounded with anxiety that made his hands tremble. He waited in a hallway with other candidates, nodding their expensive clothes, their confident postures, their easy conversations about teachers and techniques he had never heard of. He felt like in a village boy playing dress-up in a world where he did not belong. When his name was called, walked into the audition room on legs that felt like they might buckle at any moment. A panel of judges sat behind a long table, their faces neutral and unreadable. A grand piano stood in the center of the room, magnificent and terrifying. It was even more beautiful than the one in the factory owner's house, a concert instrument with a sound that would expose every flaw in his playing. Sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. They felt cold under his fingertips. He heard his voice in his head, reminding him to breathe, to relax, to trust himself. He closed his eyes for a moment and found the silence within. He began to play. The piece was a Chopin nocturne, chosen because it showcased both technical skill and emotional depth. The first notes came out hesitant, his nervousness evident in the slight trembling of the melody. But as he continued, something began to shift. The room around him faded away, the judges disappeared, even his own anxiety became distant. There was only the music, flowing from somewhere deep inside him, pouring through his fingers into the piano and filling the air with sound. He played not for the judges, not for the scholarship, not for his future. He played for the 7-year-old boy who had stood frozen in a doorway, hearing piano music for the first time. He played for who had believed in him when no one else would. He played for his mother, who had sacrificed so much to give him this chance. He played for everyone who had ever been told that their dreams were too big for their circumstances. When the final note faded, opened his eyes slowly, returning to the present. The room was silent. The judges looked at each other with expressions he could not read. One of them, an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes, leaned forward and asked a question. Who had taught him? Answered truthfully, describing his unusual education, the old man in the music shop, the cardboard keyboard, the years of silence, and finally, intensive preparation. The judges listened with growing surprise. They had assumed from his playing that he had been trained at prestigious institutions, perhaps even abroad. To learn that he was largely self-taught was remarkable. The deliberation that followed felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, the elderly judge spoke. He said that the panel had rarely witnessed such a combination of natural talent and emotional depth. His technique needed work, that was clear. His foundation had gaps that would require attention, but the raw material was exceptional, perhaps among the best they had seen in years. The scholarship committee would be foolish not to invest in such potential. He was pleased to inform that he had been accepted into the program, with a full scholarship covering tuition, accommodation, and a small stipend for living expenses. Did not remember leaving the room. He did not remember finding waiting outside or seeing her face light up when she heard the news. He did not remember the congratulations or the arrangements that followed. His mind was floating somewhere above his body, unable to process what had just happened. The dream that had been deferred, nearly destroyed, had finally come true. He was going to study music. He was going to become a real pianist. The world that had pushed him down was finally letting him rise. That night called home from a public telephone booth, his voice cracking with emotion. His mother answered, her greeting anxious and hopeful. When he told her the news, she began to cry, happy tears that she made no effort to hide. She said she had prayed every day since he left, had barely slept wondering how the audition would go. She had always known he was special, always believed he was meant for something greater than the life their circumstances offered. Now the world was starting to see what she had seen all along. She was so proud of him, so incredibly proud. His father came to the phone reluctantly, his voice gruff and distant, told him about the scholarship, about the judge's praise, about the opportunity that lay ahead. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then his father said something that would remember for the rest of his life. He said that maybe he had been wrong. Maybe dreams were not always foolish. Maybe his son was made of something different than he had understood. He still did not entirely approve of this path, still worried about the difficulties ahead. But he was willing to admit that had proven him wrong. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was a little proud too. The next chapter of his life began the following month when formal classes started at the school. He moved into a small dormitory room, the most private space he had ever had in his life. He received textbooks and sheet music, was assigned practice rooms and teachers, was welcomed into a community of young musicians from backgrounds vastly different from his own. The first weeks were overwhelming, filled with new information, new faces, new experiences that came at him faster than he could process. But slowly, he began to find his footing. His teachers were impressed by his progress and challenged by his gaps. They worked with him intensively, correcting the technical issues that years of unconventional practice had created. His hand position was adjusted, his finger strength developed, his understanding of theory deepened. It was like learning to walk again after a lifetime of moving in awkward ways. Sometimes felt frustrated, feeling that all his natural instincts were being criticized and changed. But he trusted the process, understood that the foundation being built now would support everything he wanted to achieve later. The other students were a mixed group. Some came from musical families with generations of tradition behind them. Others were wealthy children who treated music as one hobby among many. A few had struggled though none had faced quite the same obstacles. He made friends slowly, his village background and unconventional history making him something of a curiosity. Some students looked down on him, seeing his origins as a mark against him. Others admired his journey and treated him with respect he was not accustomed to receiving. He learned to navigate these social dynamics with the same determination he brought to his music. The months turned into years and blossomed under proper training. His technique improved dramatically, the raw talent being refined into polished skill. He learned new repertoires, expanded his musical knowledge, participated in student recitals that built his confidence as a performer. His teachers spoke of him as one of the most promising students they had seen, someone who could achieve great things if he continued to work hard. Heard these praises with a mixture of gratitude and awareness that the hardest part was still ahead. He went home for visits when he could afford the bus fare, returning to the village as a changed person. The construction sites where he once worked seemed smaller now, the dusty streets less oppressive. His siblings had grown during his absences, their lives continuing in the rhythm he had left behind. His mother looked older each time he saw her, the years of hard work taking their toll. But her eyes still lit up when she saw him, still filled with pride that her son was doing something extraordinary. His father remained gruff and distant, uncomfortable expressing the affection he clearly felt. But he no longer dismissed path as foolish. The boy had proven something that the father was still trying to understand. During one of these visits, learned that the factory owner had died. A heart attack had taken him suddenly, leaving behind a family in turmoil as relatives fought over his empire. The daughter who had once screamed at the sight of in her music room was now a married woman living abroad, her piano probably gathering dust in the empty house. The men who had attacked shop had scattered to various fates, their violence forgotten by everyone except those who had suffered it. Time had moved on, settling old scores in ways that human justice never could. Felt nothing for the dead man except a distant neutrality. The hatred he might have harbored had long been transformed into determination. The best revenge was living well, and intended to live very well indeed. His final year at the school was marked by an announcement that sent ripples of excitement through the student body. A national competition for young pianists would be held in the capital, with judges including some of the most respected names in classical music. The winner would receive not only prize money, but also an opportunity to perform at major concert halls across the country and abroad. It was the kind of opportunity that could launch a career, transforming a promising student into a recognized professional. Applications were open to anyone under 25, and the school encouraged its best students to participate. Who had remained his mentor throughout his studies, urged him to apply. She believed he was ready, that his skills had developed to a level where he could compete with anyone in the country. More importantly, she knew that the story behind his music would resonate with audiences and judges alike. Classical music in India was often seen as the domain of the privileged, a hobby for the wealthy rather than a calling for the common person. Represented something different, a reminder that talent could emerge from the most unexpected places. His success would not just be personal but symbolic, challenging assumptions about who could and could not achieve greatness. Was hesitant at first. The competition would include students from the finest conservatories, children of musical dynasties who had been training since they could walk. What chance did a village boy with a few years of proper education have against such competition? But faith in him was unwavering, and his own ambition, suppressed for so long, began to reassert itself. He had not come this far to stop at the threshold of his dreams. He would enter the competition, give everything he had, and accept whatever outcome fate decided. At least he would know that he had tried. The preparations for the competition consumed the following months. Selected his pieces carefully, choosing works that showcased both technical mastery and emotional depth. He practiced until his fingers ached, until the notes became as natural as breathing. He studied recordings of great pianists, analyzing their interpretations, seeking inspiration for his own. He worked on his stage presence, his ability to connect with an audience, his capacity to transform performance anxiety into focused energy. By the time the competition approached, he felt as ready as he would ever be. Letters came from home during this period, his mother's handwriting growing shakier with each one. She was ill, he learned, some kind of problem with her breathing that the village doctor could not properly diagnose. She urged him not to worry, not to let concern for her distract from his important work, but worried anyway, sending home what money he could from his small stipend, promising himself that, when he succeeded, he would bring her to the city where proper doctors could examine her. His mother's health became another motivation, another reason to push through exhaustion and doubt. She had sacrificed so much for him. The least he could do was achieve the success that would allow him to take care of her in return. The competition was held in a magnificent concert hall in the nation's capital, a building with perfect acoustics and seating for thousands. Arrived a day early, walking through the empty space, trying to imagine himself on the stage with all those seats filled. It seemed impossible, absurd, a fantasy that could not be real. But he had thought the same thing about touching a piano, about taking lessons, about getting a scholarship. Each impossible thing had become possible through determination and luck. Perhaps this would too. There were 32 competitors, whittled down from hundreds of applicants. They came from cities across India, representing the best young talent the country had to offer. The competition would proceed in 3 rounds, with judges eliminating half the field after each. The finals would feature 4 pianists performing full concerts to a live audience and a panel of distinguished judges. Knew the odds were against him. Most of the others had advantages he lacked, backgrounds and resources and connections that smoothed their paths. But he had something too, a hunger born of deprivation, a passion forged in struggle. These were weapons that could not be bought or inherited. The first round went well. Played his selected piece with precision and feeling, earning praise from the judges and advancement to the next round. The second round was harder, the competition fiercer, the pressure greater. He watched other contestants perform with skills that seemed superhuman, their fingers moving at speeds he could barely track, their interpretations revealing depths he had not imagined. Doubt crept in, whispering that he was out of his league, that he should accept a respectable early elimination and be grateful for having made it this far. But he pushed the doubt aside and took the stage when his turn came. Something happened during that second-round performance that could not explain afterward. He began playing his piece, a technically demanding composition, and suddenly found himself somewhere else entirely. He was not in the concert hall but back in his dusty shop, playing the old upright piano under a single lamp. He was on the cardboard keyboard in his small village home, practicing invisible keys while his family slept around him. He was standing in the doorway of the factory owner's house. hearing piano music for the first time and feeling his life change forever. All these moments merged into one, flowing through his music, infusing each note with the weight of his entire journey. When he finished, the audience was not silent as it had been after other performances. They erupted into applause, a spontaneous outpouring that caught even by surprise. The judges looked at each other with expressions that mixed surprise and approval. One of them, a renowned pianist who had performed on the world's greatest stages, was seen wiping his eyes. The competition was supposed to be about technical excellence, about hitting notes correctly and following tempo precisely, but had reminded everyone that music was about something more than perfection. It was about feeling, about human experience, about the ineffable connection between sound and soul. He advanced to the finals. So did three others, two men and one woman, all from musical families with impeccable credentials. They had played brilliantly throughout the competition, their technical skills undeniable. Studied them from a distance, aware that on paper he should not be their equal. Yet here he was, standing among them, about to compete for the highest prize. Whatever happened next, he had already achieved something remarkable. The village boy who had been refused entry to music rooms was now sharing stages with the best in the country. The final round would take place in 3 days. Use this time to prepare but also to rest, understanding that exhaustion could undermine the best technique. He called home and spoke to his mother, whose voice sounded weaker than he remembered. She told him she was fine, just a small cough, nothing to worry about. He wanted to believe her, but sensed she was hiding the truth to keep him focused. He promised her that after the competition, whatever the result, he would come home to see her. She made him promise something else too. She made him promise to play not for victory but for joy. The music was a gift he had been given, and gifts should be shared with gratitude, not grasped with desperation. If he remembered that, she said, he had already won. The night before the finals, could not sleep. He lay in his hotel room staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities both wonderful and terrible. What if he forgot his piece? What if his fingers cramped? What if the judges decided that his background was too different, his training too unconventional, his place at the finals a mistake that needed correcting? Fear circled like vultures, pecking at his confidence, threatening to devour everything he had built. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights spreading to the horizon. Somewhere out there, millions of people were living their lives, facing their own struggles, dreaming their own dreams. His competition, however important it felt to him, was just one small story among countless others. This thought somehow brought comfort. The pressure eased. He returned to bed and finally fell asleep. The morning of the finals arrived with a sky washed clean by overnight rain. Woke early, his body rested despite the anxiety that had plagued him for days. He went through his morning routine with deliberate calm, eating a light breakfast, stretching his hands and wrists, reviewing his music in his mind without touching a keyboard. There was a superstition among performers that too much practice on the day of a concert could drain the spontaneity from a performance. Did not know if this was true, but he chose to trust it. His fingers knew what to do. His heart knew what to feel. All that remained was to bring both together on stage. The concert hall filled throughout the afternoon as audience members claimed their seats. They came from all corners of the music world, critics and teachers and enthusiasts who wanted to witness the emergence of new talent. The competition had generated buzz in cultural circles, partly because of the high quality of this year's finalists, and partly because of the unusual story of one particular competitor. Word had spread about the village boy who had taught himself on cardboard, the servant's son who had social barriers to reach these heights. Some came out of genuine curiosity to hear him play. Others came with skepticism, doubting that anyone from such a background could truly compete at the highest level. A few came simply for the spectacle, treating story as an exotic entertainment rather than a human achievement. The 4 finalists gathered backstage, each wrapped in their own preparations, observed his competitors with quiet attention. There was the son of a legendary violinist whose entire life had been shaped for musical achievement. There was a young woman from Chennai whose family had produced musicians for 7 generations. And there was a prodigy who had given his first concert at age 10 and had studied in Vienna before returning to India. They carried themselves with the confident ease of people who belonged, whose presence in this competition surprised no one. Their certainty, even as he recognized that his own journey gave him something they lacked. The order of performance was drawn by lot. Drew third position, which meant he would play after and but before. This was neither the best nor the worst placement. Going first carried the burden of setting expectations without knowing what others would deliver. Going last carried the advantage of adjusting one's approach based on what had come before. The middle positions were neutral territory, judged on their own merits, accepted his placement without reaction. The order would not change the music he intended to make. Performed first, his interpretation of sonata drawing on years of conservatory training. His technique was flawless, each note struck with precision, each phrase shaped with scholarly understanding. The audience applauded appreciatively, recognizing the excellence of his execution. But listening from backstage, noticed something absent from the performance. There was mastery but no mystery, skill without surprise. The music was beautiful in the way that a perfectly sculpted statue is beautiful, impressive to look at but cold to the touch. Followed with a composition that showcased his extraordinary technical abilities. His fingers moved across the keys with speed that seemed almost impossible, producing cascades of notes that dazzled the ear. The audience murmured with amazement at his virtuosity, and when he finished, the applause was loud and prolonged. Here was genuine brilliance, a level of mechanical perfection that few could match. Felt a flutter of intimidation watching from the wings. How could he compete against such obvious talent? His own technique, though improved, could not approach these heights of flashy execution. But as the applause faded and preparations began for the next performance, remembered something had told him during their early lessons. She had said that music was not a competition of speed or complexity. It was communication, a language that spoke heart to heart. The greatest pianists were not always the fastest or most technically perfect. They were the ones who made listeners feel, who used notes and silences to tell stories that words could not express. Strength had never been flashy technique. It was emotional truth, the ability to infuse every phrase with meaning that resonated deep within. His name was called, and he walked onto the stage with measured steps. The lights were brighter than he had expected, warming his face and making the audience fade into shadows beyond. The piano waited at center stage, a beautiful grand that gleamed under the spotlights. Approached it slowly, taking time to breathe, to center himself, to let the nervousness transform into focused energy. He sat down on the bench and adjusted his position slightly, finding the placement that felt natural. Then he placed his hands on the keys and waited. The hall fell silent, thousands of breaths held in anticipation. Closed his eyes and let himself remember. He remembered his mother's worn hands, cracked from washing clothes in cold water. He remembered his father's weathered face, aged beyond its years by labor and worry. He remembered's gentle voice, teaching him scales by lamplight, believing in him when the world did not. He remembered the sound of piano music floating through a rich house, calling to him across barriers of caste and class, awakening something that had slumbered in his soul without knowing its own name. All of this flowed into his hands as he began to play. The piece he had chosen for the finals was Moonlight Sonata, followed by a Chopin Ballade. These were not the flashiest selections, not the most technically demanding, but they were works of profound emotional depth, pieces that rewarded sensitivity over speed, interpretation over acrobatics. Had chosen them precisely because they played to his strengths, allowing him to show the judges and audience what made him different from the other competitors. If he was going to win or lose, he wanted it to be on his own terms. The opening of the Moonlight Sonata flowed from his fingers like moonlight itself, gentle and mysterious. The famous triplet arpeggios created a shimmering texture over which the melody floated, sad and beautiful and achingly human. Played it slowly, more slowly than most pianists chose, giving each note space to breathe, letting the silences speak as eloquently as the sounds. In the audience, people who had heard this piece countless times found themselves hearing it anew. There was something different in this young man's interpretation, something that cut through familiarity to touch the raw nerve of emotion beneath. As the first movement gave way to the second and then the third, his performance took on a quality that transcended mere music. He was not just playing notes but telling a story, his story, a tale of longing and struggle and refusal to surrender. The stormy passages of the final movement became expressions of anger at injustice, of frustration against barriers that should never have existed. The moments of tenderness became love letters to those who had believed in him, gratitude expressed in the only language he truly mastered. By the time the sonata reached its crashing conclusion, several audience members were openly weeping. The Chopin ballade that followed was even more personal. This was the first piece of complex music that had ever learned under his guidance, the work he had practiced on his cardboard piano countless times before ever playing it on real keys. It held memories of those secret midnight lessons, of an old man's kindness in a cruel world, of a friendship that had cost both of them dearly but had given them both something precious in return. Poured all of this into his playing, transforming technical passages into emotional journeys, shaping phrases with the sensitivity of someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. The final chord hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence, lifted his hands from the keys and sat still, feeling suddenly drained, as if he had run a marathon rather than played two piano pieces. He was not sure how long he sat there before the applause began. It started tentatively, a few hands clapping in the darkness beyond the stage lights. Then it grew, swelling into a wave that washed over him with almost physical force. People were standing, he realized, rising from their seats to acknowledge what they had witnessed. A standing ovation at a competition was not unheard of but not common either. It meant something significant. He rose from the bench and bowed, his movements automatic, his mind still half lost in the world of the music. As his eyes adjusted to the lights, he could see faces in the audience, some smiling, some crying, all looking at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable and proud at the same time. He had done what he came to do. He had shared the best of himself, the music that lived in his heart, the art that had cost him so much to pursue. Whatever the judges decided, this moment was his, unassailable and complete. Backstage and congratulated him with expressions that mixed admiration and concern. They had expected competition, but not this kind, not a rival who fought on entirely different terrain. Their technical superiority suddenly seemed less decisive. Music competitions were judged on multiple criteria, and emotional impact was one of them. His performance had shifted the conversation, reminding everyone that the purpose of music was not to impress but to move. Whether the judges would weight this appropriately remained to be seen, but the battle lines had been redrawn. Performed last, delivering a strong interpretation that showcased her considerable skills. She was a complete musician, technically proficient and emotionally engaged, the kind of artist who could build a solid career without ever making headlines. Her performance was excellent by any reasonable standard, but it had the misfortune of followings, which had raised the emotional stakes to a level that excellence alone could not match. The audience applauded warmly when she finished, but the standing ovation did not repeat. The evening's defining moment had already occurred. The judges deliberated for 2 hours while the audience mingled in the lobby and the competitors waited in a green room that grew increasingly tense as time passed. Tried to read a book he had brought but could not focus on the words. He tried to meditate, but his mind would not still. He tried to make conversation with the others, but found that none of them were in a mood for talking. They all sat with their thoughts, processing the evening, wondering what the judges were saying, hopping and fearing in equal measure. Finally, an assistant appeared and asked them to return to the stage. The audience was being seated for the announcement. Walked out into the lights again, standing in a line with his 3 competitors, facing the panel of judges and the crowd beyond. The head judge, a silver-haired woman who had been a concert pianist of international renown before becoming a teacher, rose from her seat and approached a microphone. She spoke about the quality of this year's competition, the difficult decisions the panel had faced, the promising futures that awaited all 4 finalists regardless of tonight's result. Then she announced the results in reverse order. 4th place went to, whose technically perfect performance had not quite ignited the emotional connection the judges were seeking. 3rd place went to, whose well-rounded excellence was praised but deemed slightly short of the transcendence required for the top spots. 2nd place went to, whose dazzling virtuosity had impressed the panel but had not moved them as deeply as another performance had. And 1st place, the grand prize, the victory that would launch a career and make history, went to. The announcement washed over him like a wave crashing on shore. He heard cheering from the audience, felt hands patting his back, saw faces smiling at him with joy and congratulation. But it was all happening at a distance, separated from his direct experience by a layer of disbelief. He had won. The village boy who had been refused permission to touch a piano, who had practiced on cardboard, who had been told that people like him did not get to have dreams like this, had just won the most prestigious piano competition in the country. It was impossible. It was real. Both things were true at once. The ceremony that followed passed in a blur. Received a trophy that was almost too heavy to hold, a check that represented more money than his family had ever seen, and promises of concert engagements that would take years to fulfill. He gave a brief speech that he barely remembered afterward, something about gratitude and perseverance, and the people who had helped him along the way. He mentioned by name, wishing the old man could have been there to see what his secret lessons had produced. He mentioned his mother, whose sacrifices had made everything possible. He mentioned, without whom he would never have found his way to this stage. After the official events concluded, there was a reception where was surrounded by well-wishers he did not know. Music critics wanted interviews. Concert managers wanted to discuss bookings. Parents of young piano students wanted to shake his hand and tell him he was an inspiration. Through it all, searched for familiar faces, needing an anchor in this overwhelming sea of attention. He found near the back of the room, standing alone with tears streaming down her cheeks. He pushed through the crowd to reach her, and she embraced him with the fierceness of a mother holding a child who had just survived something dangerous. She told him that she had known this was possible but had hardly dared to believe it would happen. When she had first heard him play in that community center during the monsoon, she had sensed something extraordinary buried under the rough surface. But the music world was cruel, and talent alone was rarely enough to succeed. He had needed luck, opportunity, and most of all, the courage to keep going when every rational calculation said he should give up. He had shown all of these qualities and more. She was proud of him, prouder than she had ever been of any student. Whatever came next, he should remember this night, this moment when everything changed. The news of his victory spread quickly through the media in the following days. His story was too compelling to ignore, a narrative of caste barriers transcended, of poverty overcome, of raw talent triumphing against systemic odds. Newspapers ran features about the servant's son who had become a piano champion. Television programs requested interviews. Social media exploded with discussions about his journey, some praising him as an inspiration, others questioning whether his success would be replicated or was merely a one-time anomaly. Found the attention overwhelming, but understood it was part of the package he had signed up for. Back in his village, the news arrived through a television in the tea shop, where a crowd gathered to watch their own son being celebrated on a national broadcast. His mother sat in the front row, supported by neighbors who had once whispered about her strange boy and his foolish dreams. She watched the screen with tears rolling down her cheeks, seeing her son standing on a stage she could never have imagined, holding a trophy that represented everything she had hoped for him. Her illness, which had worsened during his absence, seemed momentarily forgotten in the glow of this impossible triumph. His father stood at the back of the crowd, too proud to sit with the others, too moved to stay away entirely. He watched his son speak on television about growing up poor, about being opportunities, about finding music anyway. He heard mention him, heard his son say that even his father's opposition had been a form of love, an attempt to protect him from disappointment. Something broke open in the older man's chest, a dam that had held back emotions for years. He pushed through the crowd and walked home alone, needing privacy to process feelings he did not have words to express. When finally returned to the village 2 weeks after his victory, he found a welcome that exceeded anything he had expected. Banners hung across the main street. Children lined the road, waving and cheering. The local government had organized a reception in his honor, politicians eager to associate themselves with success that had nothing to do with them. Endured it all with patience, understanding that the celebration was not really about him, but about what he represented. He was proof that the barriers could be broken, that circumstances did not determine destiny. For a community that had known nothing but limitations, this was a message worth celebrating. His meeting with his mother was private, away from the cameras and crowds. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, her skin carrying a grayish tint that alarmed him. She embraced him for a long time, saying nothing, just holding her son who had traveled so far from the small world they had shared. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears and something else, something that looked like peace. She told him that she could die happy now, knowing that he had achieved what she had always believed he could achieve. He told her not to talk about dying, that he was going to take her to the city where proper doctors would make her well again. She smiled and did not argue, but there was something in her expression that suggested she knew things he did not want to acknowledge. His father's greeting was awkward, two men unused to showing affection trying to navigate a moment that demanded it. Extended his hand, and his father took it, but then the older man did something unexpected. He pulled his son into an embrace, clumsy and brief but unmistakable. When they separated, his father's eyes were wet. He said he had been wrong, completely wrong, and he was sorry for all the years he had tried to crush a dream that was never his to crush. Assured him there was nothing to forgive. His father had done what he thought was right with the information he had. They had both been trying to survive in a world that did not make survival easy. The past was past. What mattered now was the future they could build together. The concert engagements began within a month. Performed in Mumbai first, at a prestigious venue that had hosted international artists for decades. The hall was sold out, tickets purchased by people who wanted to hear the competition winner live, curious to see if his victory had been a fluke or a genuine arrival. He played a program of the pieces that had won him the competition, plus new works he had been preparing since then. The performance exceeded expectations, and the reviews that followed were glowing. Was the real thing, critics agreed, a talent that would continue to develop and a story that would continue to inspire. More concerts followed in other cities. Delhi, Kolkata, Bangalore, Chennai, each with its own audience hungry to hear the young pianist everyone was talking about. Traveled constantly, living out of hotel rooms, practicing wherever he could find a piano, performing with an intensity that drained him even as it exhilarated him. He was finally doing what he had dreamed of since that first moment in the factory owner's music room. He was making music for people who wanted to hear it, sharing the gift that had nearly been stolen from him so many times. But success brought complications he had not anticipated. The concert fees were substantial, more money than he had ever imagined, but they came with demands that went beyond just playing well. There were managers who wanted to control his career, record labels that wanted to sign him to contracts he did not understand, sponsors who wanted to attach their brands to his story. Found himself navigating a business world as complex and treacherous as the music itself. He made mistakes, trusted people he should not have trusted, signed agreements that benefited others more than himself. The village boy was learning hard lessons about how success could be exploited. Through it all, his mother's health continued to decline. He brought her to the city as he had promised, consulting specialists who diagnosed an advanced lung disease, probably caused by years of exposure to washing chemicals without protection. Treatment was available but expensive and uncertain. Paid for everything, emptying his concert earnings into medical bills that seemed to multiply without end. He visited her hospital room between performances, bringing flowers and stories of his latest concerts, trying to keep her spirits up while watching her grow weaker day by day. She told him during one of these visits that she was proud of him but worried. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain of trying to build a career while caring for her, the weight of expectations that grew heavier with each success. She reminded him of what she had said before the competition. The music was a gift to be shared with joy, not a burden to be carried with desperation. He should play because he loved it, not because he had to prove anything to anyone. The world had already acknowledged his talent. Now he needed to find the sustainable path, the way to continue for a lifetime rather than burning out in a few brilliant years. Her words stayed with him as her condition worsened. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do except make her comfortable. Canceled his upcoming concerts over the objections of his manager, who warned that reliability was crucial for a young artist building a reputation. He did not care about reputation. His mother was dying, and he would not let her go alone. He sat by her bedside for hours each day, sometimes playing recordings of his concerts on a small speaker, letting her hear the music she had sacrificed so much to make possible. She died on a quiet morning, with sunlight streaming through the hospital window and holding her hand. Her last words were a whisper that he had to lean close to hear. She told him she loved him, had always loved him, would love him from wherever she was going. She told him to keep playing, to never let the music die, to share with the world what she had always known lived inside him. Then her eyes closed, and her breathing stopped, and the woman who had believed in him from the very beginning was gone. The grief that followed was unlike anything he'd experienced. It was not the sharp pain of sudden loss but a vast emptiness that swallowed everything, a silence where his mother's voice should have been. He went through the rituals of death in a daze, the funeral and the mourning period, and the endless stream of condolences from relatives he barely knew. His father stood beside him throughout, their shared loss creating a bond that years of conflict had prevented. They did not speak much, but they did not need to. They understood each other's pain without words. Did not touch a piano for 3 months after his mother's death. The instrument that had been his salvation now felt like an unbearable reminder of everything he had lost. His mother had loved hearing him play, had made him promise to continue, but every time he sat at a keyboard, he broke down in tears before his fingers could touch the keys. His manager grew increasingly worried, warning that the music world had a short memory, that his absence was creating opportunities for rivals, that if he did not return soon, everything he had built would crumble. But was not ready to return. He needed time to grieve, to process, to find his way back to the music through the fog of loss. He went to the village and stayed in the house where he had grown up, now emptier than ever with his mother gone and his siblings scattered to their own lives. He walked the streets where he had once dreamed impossible dreams. He sat in the spot where his music shop had stood, now replaced by a mobile phone store. He let himself feel everything, the pain and the gratitude and the strange peace that came from knowing his mother had seen his success before she died. One evening, while wandering through the village at sunset, he heard music coming from an unexpected source. It was a small temple at the edge of the village, a place he had passed countless times without paying attention. Inside, someone was playing a harmonium, a wheezy old instrument that wheezed and squeaked but still produced recognizable melodies. Followed the sound and found an elderly priest sitting alone, his eyes closed, his fingers moving across the keys with the simple faith of someone who played for no audience but God. Sat quietly and listened. The music was nothing special by professional standards, the technique crude, the melody simple. But there was a purity in it, a sincerity that fancy concert halls often lacked. The priest was not performing. He was praying through music, expressing devotion in the language of sound. When the song ended, the priest opened his eyes and saw sitting in the shadows. He smiled and asked if the young man would like to play, hesitated, then moved forward and sat at the harmonium. His hands found the keys, and for the first time in months, music flowed from his fingers without tears. The harmonium was nothing like a piano, limited and basic, but that simplicity was what he needed. He played a hymn his mother used to sing, a melody from his childhood that he had almost forgotten. As the notes filled the small temple, something inside him began to heal. The grief did not disappear, but it transformed, becoming part of the music rather than blocking it. His mother had asked him to keep playing. He was finally able to honor that request. The return to his career came gradually, then suddenly. Started practicing again, at first just simple exercises, then increasingly complex pieces. He reconnected with, who had been waiting anxiously for news, and told her he was ready to perform again. She arranged a small concert in an intimate venue, a comeback that would test his readiness without the pressure of a major event. Prepared carefully, choosing a program that reflected his journey through grief toward renewal. He was not the same pianist who had won the competition. He was someone older, sadder, and perhaps wiser, someone who understood that music was not just about technical excellence or even emotional expression, but about something deeper still. The comeback concert took place on a winter evening when the air was crisp and the city lights sparkled against a dark sky. The venue was a small auditorium that seated perhaps 200 people, intimate enough that could see faces in the audience but formal enough to feel like a real performance rather than a practice session. Had invited carefully selected guests, critics who had followed his career, teachers who had known his work, and friends who wanted to support his return. There were no cameras, no publicity, just music and the people who had come to hear it. Walked onto the stage with measured steps, more aware than ever of the weight of the moment. His hiatus had lasted 6 months, long enough for some to write him off as a one-hit wonder who could not handle the pressures of professional life. He heard the whispers, knew that skeptics were waiting for him to fail, wondering if his triumph had been luck rather than talent. But he also knew something they did not. He had faced worse than skepticism. He had faced poverty, discrimination, violence, and loss. A few doubting voices could not shake a foundation built on such solid ground. The program he had chosen reflected his transformation. He opened with, whose mathematical precision provided structure and clarity, a way of announcing that his technique remained intact despite the long break. Then he moved to Brahms, whose romantic warmth carried echoes of the love he had known and lost. He played pieces he had never performed publicly before, works he had discovered during his months of isolation, music that spoke to the particular shade of his grief and healing. Each selection was a chapter in an ongoing story, and the audience, whether they understood the specifics or not, could feel the narrative arc unfolding before them. The centerpiece of the concert was a new composition, something had written himself during the dark months after his mother's death. It was not a conventional classical piece, but a hybrid work that drew on Indian melodic traditions while employing Western harmonic structures. He called it simply Mother, a title that needed no elaboration. The music began quietly, with a simple melody that evoked lullabies and childhood memories. It built slowly, adding layers of complexity, weaving through emotions that moved from tenderness to sorrow to anger to acceptance. The climax was a cascade of notes that seemed to contain all the tears he had ever shed, all the words he had never said, all the gratitude he could not express while she was alive. When the composition ended, the audience sat in absolute stillness. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. Then, slowly, sound returned, first a single person clapping, then others joining, the applause growing until it filled the room with a warmth that was different from the ovations had received before. This was not admiration for technical skill or even appreciation for emotional depth. It was recognition of something shared, an acknowledgement that the music had touched something universal in the human experience. Several audience members were crying openly, moved by a piece that had given voice to their own unspoken griefs. The reviews that followed were the best of his career. Critics who had been unsure about his future wrote that his hiatus had actually deepened his artistry, that the loss he had suffered had added dimensions to his playing that competition victories could not have produced. His original composition drew particular attention, praised as a breakthrough that announced him not just as an interpreter of other composers' works, but as a creative voice in his own right. The comeback was complete. The doubters were silenced. Was back, and he was better than ever. Concert invitations flooded in, more than he could possibly accept. Prestigious venues in Europe and America wanted to book him. Recording companies competed for the rights to his music. His original composition was performed by other pianists, spreading his name beyond the circuit of live performances. Found himself at the center of a career that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. The village boy who had once dreamed of simply touching a piano was now a recognized artist on the international stage, his name spoken in the same conversations as the masters he had studied and admired. But success this time felt different than it had before. Had learned from his first wave of fame, from the mistakes he had made, and the people who had exploited his naivety. He assembled a team he could trust, including as his artistic advisor, and made decisions with careful thought rather than excited impulse. He balanced performing with rest, understanding that burnout would serve no one. He continued composing, creating new works that drew on his unique perspective as someone who had seen both sides of life's possibilities. He was building something sustainable, a career that could last decades rather than flaming out in a few brilliant years. His relationship with his father also evolved during this period. The older man had moved to the city to live with, their village home too empty and filled with memories to bear alone. The arrangement was awkward at first, two people who had spent years in conflict trying to learn how to simply be together. But shared grief has a way of dissolving old barriers. They began to talk, really talk, about things they had never discussed before. Learned about his father's own crushed dreams, ambitions that poverty had buried before they could take root. His father learned about the depth of his son's passion, the force that had driven him against all rational odds. They discovered that they were more alike than either had realized, two stubborn souls refusing to surrender to circumstances. One evening, while was preparing for a particularly important concert, his father asked a question that caught him off guard. The older man wanted to know what it felt like to play piano, really felt like, not the technical mechanics but the inner experience. Thought for a long moment before answering. He said it felt like speaking in a language more honest than words, like communicating directly from heart to heart without the distortions that speech always introduced. He said it felt like prayer, or perhaps like the answered prayer, a connection to something larger than himself. His father listened with an expression that mixed confusion with wonder. He said he was glad that his son had found such a thing, even if he himself would never understand it. International touring began in his third year as a professional pianist. He performed in London first, at a historic hall that had hosted the greatest musicians of the past 2 centuries. The audience was sophisticated and demanding, accustomed to the highest standards, not easily impressed by novelty or compelling backstories. Knew he had to prove himself on pure musical merit, that his history mattered less here than his present ability. He played with a concentration that blocked out everything except the music, giving a performance that left the audience stunned and the critics searching for superlatives. From London he went to Paris, then Vienna, then Berlin, playing in cities that had shaped the classical tradition he had worked so hard to master. He walked streets where he had walked, stood in rooms where Chopin had composed, felt the weight of history in every performance space. It was humbling and inspiring at once. He was a newcomer to this ancient tradition, an outsider from a distant land, yet the music welcomed him without prejudice. Notes did not care about caste or background. They responded to whoever played them with sufficient skill and feeling. America came next, with concerts in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. American audiences were different from European ones, more enthusiastic in their responses, more willing to treat performers like celebrities rather than just artists. Found the attention overwhelming at times but learned to navigate it with grace. He gave interviews where he told his story, understanding that his journey resonated with people who faced their own barriers and dreamed their own impossible dreams. He became not just a pianist but a symbol, proof that circumstances did not have to determine destiny. But even as his fame grew, never forgot where he had come from. He established a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to providing music education to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. He funded scholarships that allowed talented young people to study at institutions they could never otherwise afford. He visited schools in poor areas, playing concerts for children who had never heard a live piano, hoping that some of them might discover the same spark that had ignited in him so many years ago. He understood that his success was unusual, that the barriers he had overcome still stood for most people like him. The least he could do was try to lower those barriers for others. One of the Foundation's first major initiatives was to find the old man who had given his first real lessons. It had been over a decade since the attack that had driven away, and tracing him proved difficult, but resources and determination eventually succeeded. Was located in a small town in western India, living alone in modest circumstances, his health failing but his spirit intact. Traveled to see him personally, arriving unannounced at the old man's door. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Had followed his student's career from a distance, watching news reports and reading articles with a mixture of pride and wonder. He had never expected to see again, had assumed that the famous pianist would have forgotten the humble teacher who had given him a few months of secret lessons. But here stood, offering gratitude that had only deepened with years and success. He told that everything he had achieved traced back to those stolen hours in the dusty music shop, to the old man's courage in defying the powerful and teaching the powerless. Without, there would be no concerts, no competitions, no international career. The debt could never be repaid, but intended to try. He moved to a comfortable apartment in a city with good medical facilities, covering all expenses without condition. He arranged for the old man to attend his concerts, ensuring the best seats and personal attention. He published a memoir that devoted an entire chapter to his role in his development, making sure the world knew the name of the teacher who had risked everything for a student he barely knew. And he established an award in his name, recognizing music teachers who went beyond their duties to nurture talented students from difficult circumstances. Lived long enough to see perform at Carnegie Hall, the most prestigious concert venue in the world. He sat in the front row, his aged eyes wet with tears, watching the boy he had once taught now commanding a stage that the greatest musicians in history had graced. When the performance ended and the standing ovation began, did something unprecedented. He walked to the edge of the stage and gestured for to stand, asking the audience to acknowledge the man without whom none of this would have been possible. The spotlight found the old teacher, and 5,000 people applauded him with an enthusiasm that rivaled what they had given the performer himself. Died peacefully 3 months later, having seen his student reach the highest peaks of the musical world. Delivered the eulogy at his funeral, speaking of debt and gratitude, and the mysterious ways that kindness ripples through time. He said that had given him more than music lessons. He had given him belief in himself, proof that his dreams were valid, evidence that not everyone in the world accepted the cruel hierarchies that kept people in their predetermined places. Every note ever played carried its gift within it. Every audience that heard him was really hearing them both. The years continued to pass, bringing new achievements and new challenges. Recorded albums that won awards and sold well beyond the usual classical audience. He composed symphonies that were performed by major orchestras. He appeared in documentaries about his life, participated in discussions about social justice in the arts, became a voice for change in a world that still resisted change. He married a woman who understood and shared his passion for music, a violinist who performed with him in concerts that showcased their partnership. They had children who grew up surrounded by music, free to pursue whatever paths called to them, their futures unencumbered by the limitations that had constrained their father's early years. His foundation grew into a significant force for educational equity, supporting hundreds of students across India and eventually expanding to other countries. The scholarships it provided changed lives, opening doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Some of its beneficiaries went on to musical careers of their own, becoming teachers and performers who carried forward the chain of opportunity. Others used their musical training as a foundation for different pursuits, doctors and engineers and entrepreneurs who credited their education with giving them the discipline and creativity they needed to succeed. The impact with each passing year, far exceeding what could achieve through his own performances alone. There was a concert, many years into his career, that considered the most meaningful of his life. It took place not in a prestigious hall but in the village where he had grown up, in a community center that had been built with contributions from his foundation. The audience was not the sophisticated elite who usually attended his performances, but the ordinary people of his childhood, farmers and laborers and shopkeepers who had known him before fame had found him. His father sat in the front row, old now and frail, but alive and present for this homecoming. The piano that played that evening was not a concert grand but a modest upright, the best instrument the village could accommodate. Its sound was imperfect, its action uneven, its tone lacking the richness of the he had grown accustomed to. But none of that mattered. He was playing for people who had never heard him live, people who had watched him grow from a strange boy tapping on cardboard to an international artist they saw on television. He was playing in the place where his journey had begun, completing a circle that had stretched across continents and decades. He chose a simple program, accessible works that did not require musical education to appreciate. He told stories between pieces, speaking in the language of his childhood, sharing memories that connected him to the audience in ways that concert programs never could. He spoke of his mother, pointing to the chair where she would have sat if she were still alive. He spoke of, whose spirit he felt present in every note. He spoke of the barriers he had faced and the people who had helped him overcome them. And he spoke of hope, the stubborn belief that things could be different, that talent and effort could triumph over circumstance, that dreams were not foolish but necessary. The concert ended with his composition Mother, the piece he had written in the depths of grief and performed first at his comeback recital. The village audience had not heard it before, did not know its history or context, but they understood it anyway, responding to the universal language of love and loss that needed no explanation. Women wept openly, remembering their own mothers. Men wiped their eyes with calloused hands, moved by emotions they rarely allowed themselves to feel. Children sat in unusual stillness, sensing that something important was happening even if they could not fully grasp what it was. When the final note faded, sat still at the piano for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything that had brought him to this place. Then he stood and faced his neighbors, his community, the people among whom he had been born and would always in some way belong. He bowed deeply, not the practiced bow of a performer, but the sincere gesture of someone honoring those he loved. The applause that followed was different from any he had received in grand halls around the world. It was the sound of home welcoming back a son who had traveled far and returned transformed, but still recognizable, still one of them. His father rose with difficulty and made his way to the stage. The two men embraced in front of everyone, the final dissolution of barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. His father spoke into his ear, words that only his son could hear. He said he was proud, prouder than he could ever express. He said he wished his wife could have been there to see this moment. And he said he was sorry for all the years he had stood in the way of a gift he had not understood. Held his father tightly and told him there was nothing to forgive, that everything that had happened, even the opposition and conflict, had shaped the man and artist he had become. The world continues to change, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, but the music endures, plays still, not as frequently as in his younger years, but with the depth that only time and experience can bring. His performances draw audiences who include both those who know his legendary story and those who simply want to hear beautiful music played beautifully. He teaches occasionally, passing on what he has learned to students who remind him of his younger self, hungry and determined, and full of dreams that rational people would call impossible. He visits his mother's grave on her death anniversary every year, sitting in the village cemetery where generations of his family are buried. He tells her about his life, his achievements, his challenges, speaking as if she can hear him, trusting that somehow she can. He thanks her for believing in him, for fighting for him, for giving him the foundation on which everything else was built. He promises to keep playing, to keep sharing the gifts she nurtured, to keep making her proud wherever she might be watching from. The piano in the village community center remains there, tuned and maintained by a local teacher who uses it to give lessons to children whose families could never afford private instruction. Among those children, there might be another soul burning with music that demands expression, another story waiting to unfold against improbable odds. The foundation watches for such children, ready to provide support when talent reveals itself, determined to ensure that no dream dies simply because of accident of birth. The factory owner's grand house still stands, though the family is long gone, scattered by time and fortune to various fates. The piano where first heard music that changed his life has been sold, passed through various hands to destinations unknown. But the moment it created, the spark it ignited in a 7-year-old boy standing in a doorway where he did not belong, continues to ripple outward through time. That moment produced concerts heard by millions, compositions that will outlive their creator, a foundation that transforms lives, and a story that inspires anyone who hears it. This is what one moment can become when it meets a heart prepared to receive it. This is what one dream can achieve when it refuses to surrender. This is what one life can mean when it insists on meaning something. Sometimes thinks about the path not taken, the alternate version of his life where he accepted his father's judgment and became a laborer like generations before him. That version would have been respectable, sustainable, safe, but it would not have been truly his. The risks he took, the barriers he challenged, the rejection he endured, all of it was necessary to become the person he was meant to be. He sits at his piano in the early morning hours, when the house is quiet and the world outside still sleeps. His hands rest on the keys, feeling their familiar texture, remembering all the hands that have touched pianos before his, all the music that has flowed through instruments like this one for centuries. He begins to play, softly at first, then with increasing power, filling the room with sound that carries everything he is and everything he has experienced. The music speaks of struggle and triumph, of loss and renewal, of a boy who asked only to touch a piano and was refused until his fingers proved what they could do. The melody rises and falls, telling its story without words, reaching through walls and windows into the breaking dawn. Somewhere in the village where was born, a child wakes to the sound of music playing on a radio, the same station that first broadcast news of a local boy who had done the impossible. That child does not yet know that dreams are supposed to be impossible. That child does not yet know that some doors are meant to stay closed. That child only knows that the music is beautiful, and something inside them wants to make sounds like that someday. And so the cycle continues, hope kindling hope, one generation lighting the way for the next, music transcending all the barriers that humans erect against each other. This is the legacy of a boy named who pleaded to touch the piano, was refused, and then made his fingers spark wonders that the world could not ignore. His story does not end because true stories never really end. They flow forward into futures they helped create, becoming part of the endless song that is humanity at its best. The piano waits, always waits, for the next pair of hands brave enough to reach for its keys and discover the music that lives within.